Hi, my name is Wayne Pierce. I'm Executive Director of the Equity Center, and we have a series of school finance videos that we're going to share with you. And this first one was just an overview of the Foundation School Program. And one of the things that we've done to keep from it just being overwhelming is that we're going to go through it at a level that's just very simple. And then as we go through this, you'll see we'll start looping back through and going into a little bit more depth. However, you need to know that school finance is overly complex. Doesn't have to be that way, but over the years we've added Band-Aids and it's collected barnacles, and so we're now in a situation where if there's lots of caveats and things that would really confuse matters, and we're going to avoid those. And as time goes on and as you learn more, you'll be able to see, oh, well, that doesn't fit exactly what I've understood. That's one of those special deals that's created some of the complexity. So having started with that, let's go forward with an overview of the Foundation School Program. And basically, the Foundation School Program is made up of two general components. One of them is the maintenance and operations part, and the other is the INS, or interest and sinking part. Now, the M&O is for the everyday instruction and operations, and you can see listed on the slide there the things that it's used for. And on the other side, on the right-hand side, you can see the things that INS is commonly used for. And you'll notice that sometimes they're very different, but other times you can fund some things out of M&O that you can also fund out of INS and vice versa. But for the most part, think about M&O, maintenance and operations, as being the maintenance, operations, and instructional part of the Foundation School Program. And I do want to call your attention to some of the things that are in there, and you can read those, but I want to especially call your attention to that you can do capital outlay out of the M&O. But mostly when you're building, a new campus, you're going to do that out of INS. Now, INS requires that you have voter approval to sell bonds and to make payments over a period of years, much like buying a home or a car. But you can use INS for things beyond just construction, even though that's what it's primarily there for. And it has to be bonded debt. It has to be something that your voters have approved, and you've also been authorized to set a tax rate sufficient to make those payments. You'll notice a couple of things that are in there. And with the facilities is furniture, technology, and that's important because whenever you're building a completely new campus, the cost of the furniture, the cost of the technology and other things that go along with putting everything together for a new campus would be so massive that you wouldn't have enough money out of the M&O side to pay for those things, so you make those part of the debt. One has to be careful, though, that you don't do a whole lot of just everyday technology, like some districts will pass a short-term bond, and instead of funding technology out of M&O, they will fund it out of INS, which frees up M&O money. And you need to be careful that you're not paying 30 years for something that has a life expectancy of maybe 5. But anything that is 2 years or more, that you can use that capital outlay portion of the INS to pay for that. So let's go forward now to the M&O side, and it breaks down also into two parts. The first part is Tier 1, and that's to provide adequate resources for a basic instructional program. And then Tier 2 is normally referred to as the enriched program, or the enrichment part of it, which goes beyond just the basic program. So those are the two tiers of M&O funding. And Tier 1, which is your basic instructional program, and that's where most of the money is, there are actually 10 different allotments that make that up. And we can see that it's broken down into the regular program allotment, which is the massive part of Tier 1. That's where most of your money is. And you can use the regular program allotment for teacher salaries. You can use it for librarians, counselors, your central administration, your upkeep on your buildings, transportation. All of those things can come out of the regular program. And when I say transportation, I'm talking about like extracurricular, not the transportation which you use to bring kids to school every day. And then on top of that, there are 9 special purpose allotments. There are extra costs associated with carrying out these things that are covered under these allotments. And those 9 things are listed on your screen there. So you have your regular program, and then you have those 9 special categories, categorical aid, that provides funding for those areas. If you look at the money that's spent or that the districts receive, not necessarily what is spent in a given year, you can see that the regular program is nearly 3/4 of your funding. And then you have several others that are pretty substantial, like special education, career and technology. Gifted and talented is a small part of the main allotments. Compensatory education, all of those things take up a lot of your budget, but then you have smaller things. And you can see there transportation is one of those. That is for a special purpose of getting the kids to and from school. So let's go and let's look at each one and get just a little bit of detail about what they are used for. First, special education. And the federal government has definitions of some disabilities, and when kids fit the description and have those particular needs, you can fund some of their education out of the special education allotment, because sometimes those can be quite costly. And in order for a child to be in special education, they have to go through a process where there's an ARD committee, which stands for Admission, Review, and Dismissal. And it's made up of the parents. They may bring somebody with them, an administrator, a regular program teacher, a special education teacher, and then someone who's familiar with the testing, the evaluation part of determining whether a child meets the criteria to be in the program. And you can use this money for special education salaries, for diagnosticians, special materials or equipment that might be needed, as well as special furniture that a child may have based upon their particular need. Compensatory education allotment is to supplement the regular education program, and it's for at-risk students. It's for those that are below grade level, maybe they've been retained, or they're at risk of dropping out of school, and this is money that would help to provide extra services that would keep them from dropping out and would make them successful. Bilingual English as a second language, that funding is for children who have limited English proficiency. We think about it in Texas as being primarily Spanish-speaking children, where Spanish is the dominant language spoken in the home. But it's also, there's some districts in the state that they have well over 100 different languages that children speak when they come to school as their dominant language. And so it's pretty awesome how many things that are covered under bilingual. And the idea is not just to teach them English. The idea is that you teach them also the subject matter so that as they're learning English, that they don't get behind in those areas. Career and technology allotment, sometimes it's referred to as CTE or CATE. And those have to do with learning trades or gain entry-level employment, certification in certain areas, and sometimes that's continued after high school in community colleges. Gifted and talented allotment is not necessarily for high achiever. There are lots of different things that go into what makes a child gifted and talented, and this is some special funding for those programs. There's a public education grant, which is kind of like a carrot, so that if a child is in some other school district and more than half of the kids have failed the test, it's a low-performing district meeting campus that meets certain criteria, that they can transfer into another district that's not low-performing. And this grant is to encourage the receiving district to take these children because it gives them some extra funding. New Instructional Facilities Allotment, also called NIFA, is not for the construction of instructional facilities. Sometimes people get confused on that. It's really for startup costs during the first 2 years a new campus is being operated. Then there's high school allotment, and strangely enough, it also is for dropout prevention, and we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. Transportation does not include extracurricular travel, but it does include travel when you pick children up at their home, bring them to school, and then take them back. And that's the funding levels, the amount per mile have not been changed since the early 80s. Now, that's Tier 1. That's your basic program. So on top of that, you have Tier 2, which is an enrichment beyond the basic instructional program. And keeping in style with what we've done in the earlier levels, Tier 2 breaks down into 2 levels as well. The first level is called the Golden Penny level, or Tier 2 Level 1. And that's 6 pennies of adopted M&O rate that come after the local fund assignment, the local tax rate that you're required to fund your share or a school district share of Tier 1. So there's 6 pennies, golden pennies, and they're called golden because it has a very high funding level and there is no recapture on those pennies. Beyond that, you have Tier 2, Level 2, and the name that people have given that is copper pennies because it has a relatively low funding level and there is recapture. And there's at least 11 golden pennies, and under certain circumstances, which we'll talk about in more detail in a later session, you can have more than just 11 pennies of copper pennies. There's no restrictions on what you can use Tier 2 funding for, within reason, of course. And it's just general money, and you can use it to supplement and improve upon the instructional program, the basic instructional program in Tier 1. So in addition to that, that's your M&O part, that's your instructional part. Now you go into interest and sinking, which is for debt service payments. And it's a share also, just like the M&O part is, between state funding and local funding. And there's 2 programs the state has to provide funding for facilities. One of them is Instructional Facilities Allotment, IFA, and the other one is Existing Debt Allotment, EDA. And those are for low-wealth districts in order to guarantee that they would have sufficient revenue in order to do their INS debt service payments. The local funding for all districts, whether you're poor or property wealthy, is an ad valorem tax, the INS tax rate, and those collections that come out of that for low-wealth districts are what generates the state funding, which is the state share of that. Districts that are not low wealth and can bring in more money locally than what the state system and the local funding for poor districts brings in, well, they just would have a little lower tax rate. There's no recapture on the INS part. And if you wanted to look at the relationship between state funding and the local property tax collections for INS for 2013-14, and if you can look on TEA's website under Summary of Financing, you can see these numbers. And they change because they're updated from time to time, even in a past year. But you can see that there's about $3.5 billion in local property taxes and about $600 million in state funding in those 2 programs. So the ratio of state funding to local funding for facilities is very low. And that concludes our first overview of the Foundation School program.